My name is Erin Shuttleworth, and today I'm going to be doing these mini episodes of more information on how to make comics and also just how to be creative in your day-to-day life. So today we're going to be talking about how to go from digital to print, and also we can touch a little bit on if you work only in analogs, if you only work in ink, or if you're even like a painter or something, how to do an art book. This information does translate, but we're mostly going to be talking about, from my personal experience, going from digital artwork to print. It's a little bit easier than if you work with an analog structure because there's a couple more steps you need to consider. So digital, at least it's kind of the same medium to go in that way, but there's just a lot of stuff that you wouldn't even think about. And having worked in print, I can tell you that so many people just have no clue how to make it easy on the printer and also on yourself from the beginning. So we're going to be looking from a couple of examples. First, let's go for something that's a little bit easier. So a zine style book. So you can see it's basic. This is what we call saddle stitching here. So it's got just stapling here. I like to, you probably can't see it very well, but I like to get it scored. That just kind of makes it, I don't know if you've ever seen kind of low quality zines. They'll sometimes be cracked. So the scoring helps stop it from cracking. And I also like to print it on a thicker material. So, I mean, this is all just my own personal preferences, but it can be translated. And just even knowing about all the aspects of doing this will help you when going in to get your own work printed, knowing what you need. So basic, if you're getting a zine done, what you need to tell them is what paper you want for the cover, what kind of paper you want for the inside, and then there's some specifications you need to know. So the cheapest, easiest way to do a zine is a lovely full color cover, and then black and white insides with no bleed. So no bleed is when nothing is touching the edge of the paper, and also at least 1/4 of an inch in. You can go a little bit closer, but I like 1/4 of an inch because if there's any sort of registration errors on the printer's end, especially if you want to do this super easy and cheap and do it at home, give yourself that 1/4 of an inch. It really, really helps. So you can see here, I have nothing touching the edge, and I do have a clean kind of border around here of just white space. So I've made clean margins here. You know, you can, this page is a great example. So I've got that 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and it's even on all sides. And what's nice is, unless you're doing a really, really fat zine, which I would not recommend doing, I found the thickest I could go is 32 pages. So that is 8 sheets. Math. I've been out of high school way too long. So 8 sheets of paper. Does that make sense? Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So 8 sheets of paper. Yeah, because then that's folded, and then that's 16, and that's a lot. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, let's not question my math skills. So I found, like a 32-page book is kind of the thickest I'm willing to go because they kind of like don't sit flat. If you go any more, like I don't really care about flattening these too much, but they do sit nice if I have put a weight on them. They are nice and flush. So another thing to consider too, so see how I do have bleed on my cover. So you have to, this is going to be way more complicated than I anticipated, but I'm just going to totally nerd out on printing, so I'm sorry. So what you need to do is, this is your cover file. So my cover is 8.5x11 because I've done a 5.5 by 8.5 zine. But then I've made my file have bleed. So in Indesign, you tell it to add bleed. I do 1/8 of an inch. If you're doing it in Photoshop, you actually have to make your file that much bigger. So your finished file size needs to be 8.75 inches by 11.25 inches. So that is something that you want to talk to a printer about, what they need. Yeah, 1/8 of an inch. So that's what you need to talk about, though, with your printer, is what they specifically need. Because I've had a couple of printers tell me they need 1/4 of an inch, which I think is a little bit ridiculous, but to each their own. So the printer that I go to and the one that I work with is 1/8 of an inch. for bleed. So again, that would be making your file in Photoshop 8.75 by 11.25 because that gives you the 1/8 of an inch on all sides. And again, there's no bleed on the inside, so I make it 1/4 of an inch inward so that I have that nice clean margin. And again, if registration is a little off, it's a little bit harder to tell. I find if people go like 1/8 of an inch of their margins, or even I've gotten a business card with a 16th inch margin. Do you know how difficult that is to get it to line up perfectly? Because there's also like cutting to consider. There's just so much there. So you just want to give yourself that little bit more space. Sorry, I'm just going to edit this because it's showing me. There we go. So yeah, you just want to give yourself that little bit of extra wiggle room and give the printer that little bit of extra wiggle room because it just makes everybody so much happier. So again, I did 1/4 of an inch here. And then this one we actually did the same bleed. And there's also something called crepe too. So that's how the pages like stick out a little bit here. So you can get that trimmed and you can actually, a lot of printers you can tell it that there is creep, so it'll adjust your image. But the problem is if you trim this, you need to make sure that you're not cutting off your stuff. So I find that I just don't mind it. I don't think it looks that bad. So I just leave it like that. But this one has 1/2 inch margins. So you can see there. So there's 1/2 inch in the middle here. And I just find for children's books in particular, they just look nicer with that little bit of breathing room. So I find 1/2 inch works really well. And I do also, when I design these, I make sure that all the text lines up at the top. And same with my 2020 baby one, all of the titles at the top lined up with each other to just make it look a little nicer. This is, again, like way too nerdy for most people, but just if you have that language, then you know what they're asking of you when you go to print, at least. So if they tell you, does your file have bleed, you at least know what they're asking. Because I find that like we just get too nerdy about this stuff and we don't actually tell you what we're looking for. So bleed is important if you're doing a color cover. I find what's great though, if you're doing like your own print at home zines, just give yourself that big margin and don't worry about bleed, because I find they look great on just some colored paper for the cover and then black and white paper on the inside, and it just looks lovely, and it's a great way to save costs and also just get your stuff printed on the cheap. So a way more complicated one would be Mindless Muse. So this is based on my own printing experiences, but similar places like Amazon, they have a book publishing, they also have the same specification. So it's glued here. So that means that you actually have a little bit of extra space here that you need to consider when making your file so that it's not going to get cut off from how the pages don't open all the way. Especially like if you get something really fancy that looks beautiful is, if you get it like stitched, that would be also something like physically you're cutting off some of that paper by stitching it here, right? Like you can't see it. So you want to make your file to accommodate that. So for this one in particular, it was 1/2 inch on the inside and then 1/4 of an inch here. My stuff, I really like to extend it, so I'm not as strict about my margins as long as I'm not cutting off any information. But you definitely want to keep any text or important elements out of your safe zone, so at least 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the paper. You don't have to worry about creep here because it's all even, like it lays flat because you're gluing it, so that's nice. This would be a horrible, scary thing to saddle stitch. I can't even imagine. But you just want to keep all text as far away from the edge as possible, and you also want to keep anything important. So you don't want to put like someone's face on the inside or like on, close to the edge or anything. And again, like you can see that even with that 1/2 inch, that it's still quite close. I looked at a lot of comic books and they all kind of looked the same as mine, so I was okay with it. But if you really want your margins to look perfect, definitely look at what your print shop can give you, and if that's something that is going to work for you. I did do a test through Amazon when I was doing this, and I wasn't happy with how it did my drawings. If you were just doing a regular print book, it's definitely nice because they actually don't charge you a ton for the proof. A regular print shop would probably charge you a decent amount if you wanted one copy just to look at, which I definitely would recommend if you've never done it before. I had bound stuff very similar to this, so I was okay just YOLOing it and doing 75 copies right away. But if you're going to do it through Amazon or even like somewhere like Blurb, you know, pay that little bit extra money to get that one proof to make sure, and also to double check for spelling mistakes, because that's when you find mistakes, is when you've printed it and there's the no turning back. If you go through a local print shop, they may have a proofreader who can double check it for you, which is also really nice. So that's something to weigh too, like somewhere like Amazon or Blurb or anywhere online. It might be more inexpensive, but it might actually cost you more in the long run, because you're going to have to do reprints if there are spelling mistakes, or maybe the quality wasn't what you expected and you've done 100 of them and now you need to reprint and do more. So that's something to look into as well. I'm lucky that I have a print shop with a very talented graphic designer there right now who's awesome and who's, I think, watching. So thank you. You're special. It's very complicated, but that's just something to consider. And then also for the cover, the difference is that you have a spine now. So they can usually tell you, like, if you're doing all the design work on yourself, the more power to you, because it saves you money. But oh my goodness, it is a lot of work. So you have to know how thick the paper is so that you can make this spine exactly the right size. There's a little bit, you know, it can adjust a little bit, especially because, like, I have this scored on both sides, so that kind of bends, scoring just kind of bends the paper so that it's not going to crackle and it's going to kind of just sit nicer. I find for binding books, if it's not scored, it gets really gross on the sides, and also it doesn't sit nice. Like, this sits nice and flat. So again, this is like so much, but if you just kind of want an idea of how difficult it's going to be, I'm going to tell you right away, a zine is the way to go to begin with. Printing it yourself, experimenting, keeping your costs as low as possible, that's the way to go. This is intimidating, and I had already done something like this before, and it was still overwhelming. And I cut my costs as much as possible because I actually printed it at work. I did all the labor myself. This is a more expensive option than just a straight up zine. So my recommendations for my costs personally is at least 20 zines. And this one, the price difference didn't really change between 100 copies and 75 copies. So I did 75, especially because I have to store them myself. But depending on your print shop, you may have to get more, or they may offer less. Again, somewhere like Blurb or Amazon, their costs are a little lower. But shipping can sometimes be really awful. Like, I find with Blurb, I did a couple of just like photo albums for my family, and the shipping cost me the price of one of the books. So if I got one, it was going to be like the price of two. So I did like 10 to save on the shipping, you know, so I could kind of balance it out a little better. So again, that's what's nice about like going somewhere semi-local or super local, is that you don't have to worry about shipping, and there is that personal touch. But again, like, if you don't have the funds for that, and you just want to do it all yourself, you can do this, and I would be amazed to see you do it. You need some tools, and we could go into that, because I also would love to do that. I'd love to actually start stitching books, but I would need to convince my husband to turn the downstairs into a bookbinding shop. But there are options, and they do look good if you do them right. But there's, again, like a lot of trial and error and something like that. And that's why going to a print shop, they can at least take the guesswork out of it. But this is just kind of like meant as a broad understanding of what you need to know before going in, so you're not completely overwhelmed. Something like this kid's book we did, it still has a little bit of a spine. A lot of them will tell you how thick it needs to be before you can add text on the side. So this one was considered too thin. But I think they told us for the file to do about 1/8 of an inch. So just that little bit extra space so that everything lines up when you go to bind it. We did this through Lightning Source, which is affiliated with Ingram, which is affiliated with Chapters. So this was pretty good price-wise, I think, because we did, these are color books, and we did 200 copies, and we paid American, and the shipping and everything, we still profit when we sell one. So I think that this was a several-year project. I think I did the artwork for this in 2013, and we didn't get it printed until 2015. So it was a 2-year commitment, and there was so much research. I had to teach myself how to use InDesign for this. We did a lot of, I think there are 10 drafts of this. There was a lot of back and forth. Thankfully it was my mom and me, so we gave each other the benefit of the doubt, and we were pretty calm with each other. I don't think there were any meltdowns, but this was a huge learning curve, and just thankfully, because it was my mom and this wasn't like a professional client that I had to do this for, this would have been like a freaking nightmare if I had to do this for a client at the stage I was at that point. And also, she did pay me pretty well, but definitely for the time commitment, I did not make back money for that. But it was fine because it's for my mom. But if you were to do this for a client, at least $2,500, if not more. I also did the design, so that would just be extra. This was full color digital illustrations. I mean, they're quite simple, but this was in 2013, so things were a little less fancy than they are now. And again, there was such a huge learning curve. So each page took me at least 10 hours, if not more. And again, there were so many drafts and so many sketches and so much to the process that I did not make back what I put into it. And then also this one and Mindless Muse both have ISBNs. So you can actually, in Canada, you can register for an ISBN as long as nobody else has registered in the household. So I don't know how it works for apartments, but if you own your own home or you live in a place where nobody else lives who might want to be publishing a book, you can register your address. And they give you 10 ISBNs to start, and they can always give you more. And actually, they're really great and very fast to get back to you. For Mindless Muse, someone contacted me because they asked me if I actually wanted a different type of ISBN meant for like magazines or more like short-term stuff. So it was really great that they actually know their stuff and they wanted to make sure I was using the right ISBN for what I was making. And then I was like, no, it's a graphic novel, so what I've asked for is what I need. But that's also something that's intimidating and something you need to prepare for a little bit ahead of time. This took about a month, I think, to get the ISBN. And then you can just generate a code online. And there are some rules on where they go. It's not super strict, but there's a size rule anyways, because the scanner needs to be able to read it. And you can also put the price in. I'm so glad I didn't put the price in because of COVID. I actually had to raise my price a little bit on these guys. So you can just leave it at 0. And then if you're selling it at a local bookstore, they just have to input a number for the price. But so these two are a lot of work. And if you're doing a zine, it's a little less work, especially if you don't want to worry about bleed or anything. Just make sure your artwork's not to the edge, really. And if you have a friend in art school, buy them lots of coffee and treats, and maybe they'll do it for you. But definitely don't offer them exposure. But I definitely, if someone were very keen and wanted to know, I would be willing to be bribed with food or coffee. Another one that's just kind of, this is a more basic one, is just my black and white coloring books. So the cover is the same paper as the inside. So this is done all online on a copier, which is fancy talk for it being printed. It gets printed, it gets folded, and it gets stitched all on the copier. So there's no extra labor. So where I go, they just charge a little bit extra because it slows down the copier to do this. So they charge for the staples and for the fold, essentially. But it's really inexpensive, and I always am boggled when people are like, no, I'll staple it myself. And you're like, you want to do that? It's like 5 cents each. Just pay the machine to do it. I don't understand. So that's something that I don't bother. Like with my zines, I used to staple them myself, but now I'm like, just let them do it. Let the machine do what it's been built to do, what it dreams to do. This one, because it's bigger, I find the bigger you go, the bigger you want your margins to be. So I did 1/2 inch margins here, except for the middle where when it printed, there was a glitch and it cut off the poor eyeball of this little guy. So I made my margins smaller and I moved the eyeball out a little bit because there's a couple copies going around where the eyeball is completely cut off in the middle. So that was partially on my bad and partially the printer's bad. But This is an inexpensive mistake to make, so I was not unhappy to just reprint them and, move forward from there. This is just bond paper, so this is just the paper that comes in the copier, and same with my zines. They're just the paper that comes in there. Something to consider too, if you're doing these black and white, like I like to do my kind of watercolory style. So for Skeleton Joe, it's not as big a deal, but there are a few kind of like, there's some depth in some of the drawings. So if it's being printed on a black and white toner like copier, it may not look great if you have some depth to your drawings. If it's just line work, then it's probably okay. But I request specifically to get my guts. That's what these are called. These are guts. Everything in printing is kind of gross. Bleed, guts. But I specifically asked my guts to be printed on a color copier in black and white. So the place I go has a charge for that. Some places may not, but they may be willing to do it. If you went to like somewhere like Staples, they have a rich black option, which is they print it on a color copier, but it's black. So I find that just makes my artwork look a little nicer. The rich black is like an extra option, is an extra thing too. Like when I get these printed, I don't actually do rich black. Rich black is like 4-color black, so it tends to look a little bit deeper. But I find on copiers, a lot of them run really hot on magenta, so it actually makes your line work sometimes look a little pink. So I find just tell them to print black, just black, but it just looks nicer on a color copier just because they tend to be a little better at handling files like this. But yeah, this is kind of just my in-depth and nerdy explanation to making your stuff for print. I can show you the file if I can figure out how to change my, yes, okay. So here is my file for Mindless Muse. So you can see I have the margins. So this line here is the margins, and then here is the bleed over here. So this is the edge of the paper, and then there's bleed here. And something also, because you have panels in comics, it makes it easier to like think about, but you want your margin, and then you kind of want stuff inside of the margin safer, right? So if the edge of your drawing is in the margins, then you want like text and important elements even farther in. So like I don't really have any text touching the edge, but because you have the constraint of a panel, it makes it nice. But an example here is like I have my margin here, and the speech bubble goes out because I don't care if that like got cut off a little bit, but I have the text within the margin restrictions. So that's something like, just because I have this background, it's easy for me to kind of wrap my head around, but just make more white space than you think is really the thing to consider, because my books are 5.5 by 8.5, and my artwork is on a 6x9 sheet, and then I adjust it for the the margin being uneven. You can also make your margins the same size just based on the inside margin requirement. So I could have done 1/2 inch all the way around, which would have been no problem at all, but then it might have looked a little uneven because, again, like, it's not perfect here. So I thought, well, if I give myself that 1/4 inch here and then I give myself 1/2 inch here, then they kind of balance each other out. But if you did a 1/2 inch over here, then you'd have quite a bit of white space here, and then here it still might be encroached a little bit more by the binding. But really, this is like me just geeking out really for half an hour. You do not need to know how to do this stuff, but if you can, or if you at least have an idea, it can save you money. I've definitely had people who went to like professional publishers who just keep taking their money. Like, it's ridiculous. The like pay to publish people who aren't actually printers. They just send you in a roundabout way, and I don't know. I have such a bad taste in my mouth about these like not real publishers where you still have to pay them, and they don't seem actually as knowledgeable as they present themselves, and they really just want to make a sale on you. They don't really want to help you realize your publishing needs. So definitely the more you know, the more money you can save, and just the more you know if you are being kind of like taken advantage of by someone, if they just keep coming up with prices that don't make sense. definitely shop around or even just talk to someone with some experience in it to see if you're being taken in a little bit. Because that's just, I find that if you don't know anything about this aspect of it, it's so easy to just get disheartened and overwhelmed because you just don't know how it goes from your beautiful artwork to this print media. But again, there's pretty good online options. If there is a local print shop, a lot of them will just geek out with you as long as you don't take up like a ton of their time, or if you bribe them, like if you bribe an artist or if you bribe a print shop with goodies, they will geek out with you and talk to you and help you out, especially somewhere local and small. Like if you go to Staples, maybe not, especially because when I worked at Staples, I was the only one on the floor. So I'm like, I can't even leave the copy center. And if I talk to you for any longer, I'm going to get yelled at. So read the room, see if people are like interested in talking to you or if they seem like they're going to get yelled at by a manager. But yeah, it's so much to consider and it is overwhelming, but really if you have a small printer at home, you can play around. There's lots of, a good amount of Adobe Acrobat is free-ish. So you can print PDFs. You can always print from anything Open Office I used quite a bit in university. You can use Google Docs to make your stuff. I like to use Indesign, obviously. This is Indesign here. If I could marry Indesign, I would, but unfortunately I'm already married. It's just great for laying out everything, and it as opposed to Photoshop, it does have a bleed functionality here. So I make my file the size that I want it to print. I tell it my margins, how much I want it to be, and then I tell it my bleed, and that's all separate, which is nice. It just takes, you don't have to do as much work as like in Photoshop. If you wanted to add margins in Photoshop, you have to do the rulers, and for bleed, again, you have to make your file size that much bigger. So it's not a deal breaker. I definitely have been using Photoshop a lot more, but it's just a little bit more that you need to consider. And like, especially if you say you're doing something in Procreate, there are options, but just know, that's why you just want to start the conversation sooner rather than later with a print shop, so you don't have all this beautiful finished artwork that's just not going to print because you have not considered bleed. You have important elements right at the edge, or you're just not going to get the quality that you want. So like, say you did it all in Procreate, you have these beautiful full color illustrations, you're ready to print, but you realize you don't want to have to go in and redraw that 1/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch of artwork on all of them so that they can get printed correctly. And then you end up with like awful white borders around everything. So it's just something to start thinking about sooner rather than later if you are committed to making a book. If you want to make an art book, there's other options too. And like, you just might need to have a white border around it, but there's ways to make it look nice. With 2020 Baby, all of my comics are not the same size because I make them for Instagram and some of them are longer than others. So I found a way to make them look universal by having the titles all line up with each other on each page. And then also I have little diary entries on the bottom that kind of just fill it up. So a good example are like these two, right? So this one, the artwork goes all the way to the bottom, but then this one I have this diary entry here that just kind of fills up the space a little bit. I wasn't super strict about forcing myself to write all the way to, the bottom, but it was something that I went into ahead of time, knowing that I wanted to turn these into a comic at some point. So I had already been actually writing in my sketches for these, the diary entries. So when I went to go make it digitally, I was able to just type up what I had written underneath all of my artwork. So this is probably my most successful zine, just like concept-wise, because I was able to go in from the beginning and I knew exactly what I wanted from it. Again, 20 copies is kind of my sweet spot that I've found, but ask for quotes. If you're going online, just input quantities and see when it changes. Specifically, like the gusts themselves aren't too bad because they're black and white, but the covers, a lot of places for color, they'll charge like way more for one copy versus 20 copies. So that's why I like to get 20, because that kind of makes back the cost a little bit, and it makes them cheaper per cover. So how I was talking about, like, the shipping for one thing on Blurb cost the whole price of another book, so I got 10 instead. So that's also, like, sometimes the cost of one is actually the cost of, like, 10, really, like, in the long run, just depending on where the price breaks are. And specifically on the Staples website, I would play around right around their price breaks, and it would be more expensive to get, like, 25 copies versus 30 copies, just because of how their prices break. But usually it's, like, just that it's right on the edge there. So the second you're over, you know, you're not actually going to be, like, saving a ton of money. It's just, like, right on the edge where sometimes it's, like, a little bit more expensive to print less than it is more. But really this was a good excuse for me just to geek out. And this will go up on YouTube. And if you ever see this and you have any questions, feel free to message me and ask me more. I just want to see more of these out in the world, and it is really intimidating. So please contact me if you have any questions. And you can bribe me with coffee, and I will geek out with you for hours if you want. But once you get me started, I will just keep talking, and I will keep explaining how much I love InDesign and how much I love paper, and I will touch anything that is book related and question what paper it is. So thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you next time.